Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Reward in the Middle East webinar. My name is Kayla Bittner, and I'm a member of Hay Group's team. I'd like to start off with a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please note that you can maximize your screen in the upper right corner to make the slides easier to read. The webinar is in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to send your questions through the chat feature located at the bottom left of your screen. At the end of the webinar, we'll be reviewing your questions. Today's call is scheduled for 60 minutes. We'll spend about half that time going through the presentation, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for any questions. So at this point, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Harish so that he can get started with some introductions.
Hi, Kayla. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kayla, for this opportunity. My name is Harish Bhatia. I am the unit manager for the Middle East office, and I manage the productized services business for Hay Group here. Our office is based in Dubai, and we work from here in 15 countries of the Middle East. I'll leave it to Geeta Kapoor to introduce herself, and then we'll start the presentation from there.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Geeta Kapoor, and I work alongside with Harish Bhatia in the Middle East, with prime focus on the markets of UAE and Oman. Thank you for your attendance today, and we do understand that most of you have the responsibility for Middle East in your roles. And we are all logged into this webinar today to help you gain a wider perspective on what is happening on the ground in this region. We will broadly segment the presentation in 3 themes, which will be done by Harish and myself. The first theme covers the regional business outlook study, which will give you a reality check on how organizations are performing today and what they foresee in the future. The second theme is around the global workforce outlook and how the Middle East fits in the global picture. Lastly, we will discuss about the economic outlook and the compensation trends in the Arab Gulf region. As Kayla mentioned, you can send us your questions while we run through the presentation, and we will be taking them all together at the end of the session. Next.
Thank you very much, Geeta. So I'll introduce you today just to a little background of what the study is and what you will gain from these next few slides that we're going to talk about. The Regional Business Outlook Study is something we do annually in December, January here in the Middle East. It's run across the Middle East. We've covered 700 organizations this year. This is in addition to the country research and reports that we run in each of these countries. So, of course, at any point, if you'd like more detailed information on each of the specific countries that you have operations in, we can always talk about that as well. The study is basically to look at what businesses have performed in the past 12 months and what is their future outlook. The answers mainly come from HR leaders, but, of course, it's in conjunction to what the business leaders are thinking and what they're planning for their businesses. Next slide. So before we go into the details of what the survey covered, I wanted to give you a little background to how the Middle East has fared in the past 4 years or 5 years. Since 2008, we've seen the global recession, but the global recession impacted the Middle East a year later, sometime in 2009. And you're going to see that in the GDP figures that follow ahead. What we saw is mainly an impact by the slowdown of the oil and gas across the globe. The demand went down. And the Gulf countries, as we all know, are the largest suppliers of oil and gas to the world. We saw a fall in rentals in the markets. We also saw the financial sector, which is almost the second largest sector here, spiraling down because they had large exposure to the West with large losses coming up from there. We also saw the overall economy mature with these difficult situations, which brings us to the point that the boards and the senior management executives of organizations that were rapidly growing double-digit all of a sudden saw large dips or slowdowns or almost stagnation in their businesses. And how should they deal with that is something they all learned in the past 4 years. So this is the background to how the region has fared. Not new to all of you that are in regional roles and have understood this, but we wanted to share that with you before we go into the details of how Middle East looks today. Next slide. So the survey covers 15 different sectors across 15 countries as well in the Middle East, and has surveyed about 700 organizations that have participated in this 5th climate survey that we've done. Like the slide shows, the oil and gas is one of the largest employers in the region, followed by the financial sector and the FMCG. The large portion of the other sectors is really built up by the manufacturing industrial sector in the region. Retail also is a very rapidly growing sector with a very young and growing population dynamic in this part of the world. We see the retail sector picking up very fast and also being a very high demand sector because tourism pulls in a lot more tourists to also as a retail destination in the Gulf. Next slide. So what did the survey really show us? We asked organizations a few questions on understanding what is it that they have faced as business situation in the past 12 months. Looks like good news. 2/3 of the organizations have come back to us stating they grew their business by over 5% in the past 12 months. So what you see on the chart is 2013 and 12 numbers, and this is showing you how they have fared in the 12 months before that date. So we obviously see that the growth is very significant as compared to a lot of the other areas in the world or regions in the world. But also 21% growth, 21% organizations have seen over 15% growth. That's almost over 150 organizations in the region. That speaks very robust about the economy and what the numbers look like for the market. What does this mean for all of us? In terms of people management and outlook, organizations are changing shape. Small organizations are going into medium-sized enterprises, and mid-sized organizations are now moving into large corporations. That changes the way they do business, that changes the way people are managed, and also the demand and supply ratio within the markets. The numbers you see here compared to 2012 are also much more significantly better. So, of course, good news. The idea is to share with you that Middle East is coming back on track. Governments in the Middle East, or governments mainly in the Gulf countries, are seeing GDP surpluses with the oil prices rising and also demand globally also rising for gas and oil. And this is good news because they're also investing largely into their infrastructure. So it's not only corporations and organizations, but also governments supporting the economy by not allowing it to go into a deflationary environment. Next slide. So what we saw was the last 12 months. Of course, great news to see that 2/3 of the organizations have seen growth. And it's been very good for the economy and the people living here in this part of the world. But what does it look like in the future? Almost 75% organizations reporting a forecast of growth, 5 to 15%, and about 23% are looking at same year-on-year revenues or top-line business, and only about 3% looking at lower business compared to the year before. That speaks, of course, and shows very large signs of confidence in the market. The future shows that there's more business and companies are looking to expand, both in terms of top line, but also understanding how they will grow as an organization overall. So that clearly shows us that there's more for multinationals like yourselves in this market. And I'm sure whilst we speak, business leaders in your organizations are planning to grow their business here and have mega plans. And how is that going to push all people that are working on people management to the edge to actually get more retention and better performance from the people that they have. Next. So we looked at business results and we saw how a robust economy can have its own situations. What is it that the organizations are focusing on as key areas for development internally, whilst the business leaders are out there going out to grow their business? Key management focus has been on redesigning their work processes, greater focus on performance management, reducing business-related travel, and also reducing some indirect overheads like travel costs, etc. So almost half the organizations have key focus areas where we can work on more efficiency, and clearly all of these focus areas are based on the changing dynamics of organizations, the economy, and the commerce overall in these economies. Now, this might vary differently for different countries in the Middle East. Let's not forget the Middle East can be split into two sub-regions. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which form of the main GCC countries, which are the oil-producing countries, and then there's the outer Middle East periphery formed by Jordan, Lebanon, and the likes. So whilst we speak today, we're looking at redesigning work processes and greater focus on performance management, mainly coming from the Gulf countries, where we saw organizations really growing rapidly in the last 5, 7, 10 years, while the economy and the population were growing. So with large demand and growing businesses, most organizations have matured to a size where they can now look at cutting down fat and getting more efficient. So that's the key theme for most organizations in the Gulf countries. Whilst we look at the wider Middle East, connecting back to the Arab uprising or the Arab Spring issues, we're seeing greater focus on performance management, where employees, just like citizens, are asking for more transparency, asking for more involvement within the business, and hence more focus on performance management, so employers can prove to the employees that their contribution is valued. The other areas that clearly show that organizations now, unlike before, are not taking knee-jerk reactions and not reducing costs as a short-term solution, but looking at long-term solutions of really redesigning their business to make it more efficient for the long run. Next slide. We want to ask you a question today. With all the dynamics changing and the business growing rapidly in this part of the world, I'm sure in your regional roles you have key focus areas as well. Can we ask you on your screens to select which are the key focus areas for your organization in 2013? As soon as you select, we will be bringing up the live answers and then comparing that to the answers that we have from our survey as well. You may select multiple options on this as well. Thank you all for your answers. Clearly shows that retention and talent management is one of the key concerns for most of the HR professionals and business leaders in this market. It is a big challenge, of course, globally, but in this part of the world with a very young demographic in terms of employee population, there are people looking for more contribution and very rapid career growth. It's very often we see side shift moves of employees going from one organization to the other just because they want to grow in their career and learn more. And these are the key areas we hear employees concerned about in interviews and engagement surveys. So let's now look at the results from our survey, from the Business Outlook survey. Next slide. So you'll see on here that we've also surveyed the organizations with the same metrics, and clearly matches up to what we saw on the previous slide from answers today from all of you. We see 63% organizations concerned about retention and talent management, almost the same number of organizations looking at performance management as an issue. Reward communication, a very key area and element where we've had a lot of discussions with our clients and organizations today to provide more clarity to their employees about what is it that the employers are investing in them. Training and development, also a growing need. In the past 4 years, with budgets being tightened, we saw a lot of training freeze in the markets with several organizations, which has now opened up. So with loose purse strings, organizations are ready to invest further and improvise on their people so they can contribute better to the organization. Employee engagement, again, a key issue, where rapidly changing environments require us to understand what the employees are thinking, and employee engagement is one way to understand if they are really engaged with the objective of the business. Now, rewards and benefits is an interesting subject, which was probably, if we ran this survey about 4 years ago, rewards and benefits would be the topmost concern for every HR and business professional in this region. With double-digit inflation and a rapidly growing business environment, we saw rewards and benefits being the only prime concern and the only driver for employers to be able to recruit more and more talent. However, that's changing, and now employee expectations are also changing. The Middle East, primarily the Gulf, is one of the highest paying disposable income countries and the region in the world today. With no taxation specifically in the Gulf countries, not the Middle East, we're seeing rewards and benefits now lightening as a concern. However, employees are now asking for more retention and talent management where they're differentiated because of their high performance. So those are the areas where HR professionals are focusing. And I'm sure you're seeing that change within your organizations as well. Next slide. We wanted to cover some key areas of the employee life cycle. In your everyday role, I'm sure you go through, if not all, most of these steps by yourself for your people. And in your roles with Middle East responsibilities, I'm sure there are some areas where you're having more difficulty than the others. I'm going to walk you through each of these boxes just to explain to you what is the status of this particular area in the region today. And of course, we can speak further in detail if required. Screening. Screening and selection of candidates in this part of the world has not been as professional as you would see it in the West even today. There is a lot of emphasis on relationships, on references, and what experience the people bring. So we don't still see screening in this part of the world being very automated and in large numbers. It's really specific to relationships. However, that is changing with organizations demanding larger workforce numbers and requirements. They are looking at different ways to run assessment centers, to run professional interviews rather than just references. Benchmarking jobs. Again, a key area for this region where we saw salaries being a very key element to bringing people in from different countries. So benchmarking has been a very, very active practice for most organizations, and it still remains so. Training and development as part of HR's role is a growing function, and we're seeing more and more learning and development managers being recruited, not only in multinationals, but also in local organizations, so they can get the most out of their resources today. Identifying potential. With the organizations growing from small to mid and mid to large corporations, we're seeing the need for faster, rapid growth. People are expecting it as employees, but also businesses are expecting to grow their people faster and in a more logical, unbiased manner. So we see organizations now using tools to assess people on a constant basis and grow by identifying who are the high potentials. Development areas, likely similar to what we see in identifying potential. Organizations are now and today more willing to invest in their people and help them develop for the long run. The last two themes clearly show that organizations are now shifting from short-term view to long-term, are not just looking at recruiting new people if they lose, but they're actually looking at keeping their existing people, helping them develop personally so they can get more contribution from these employees. Performance review, clearly coming from the larger regional perspective, is the need for looking at differentiation, the need for rewarding performance differently so employees can differentiate themselves and understand their involvement and contribution to the business. Reward benchmarking brings us back to benchmarking the jobs. It's clearly to understand if organizations are paying well, and employers are now also sharing their market comp ratios with their employees, so with larger transparency. Employers are also assessing engagement levels, understanding if their employees feel enabled enough to contribute successfully, and also understand the business objectives overall. In a rapidly changing environment like ours, it's quite difficult to keep employees engaged. And also, in the past 4 years, with the slowdown, it's been difficult to keep employees, especially with high performance, and keep their high morale. But this is changing with the employers assessing what are the key areas and concerns that the employees have and improvising on them for the betterment of the organization. Climate review is to understand how leaders are performing for their employees overall. In the past, we've seen, largely coming from the Arab culture and Middle Eastern culture, a very directive sense of leadership. However, that's changing based on understanding better what the climate is and how you should be changing that to grow business in times like these. Workforce planning brings us back to also redesigning business processes, which is a key area of concern for business leaders, and also efficiency being a key theme for businesses here. It's very important to plan the workforce rightly for the growth in the future. Next slide. So we spoke about the results from this survey. We'd be happy to share with you the full report following this presentation as well. We will be running a poll to understand who would like to get the report as well. What we're going to now talk about is a little bit on the global workforce outlook. We also looked at referencing some global research to understand how that compares to our region, so we can give you a better perspective of how you and your roles can compare and draw plans for this region differently than anywhere else. Next slide. So what we see here is a research done by PwC, and we've referenced to that to understand what are the key areas for business leaders today where they feel they're not equipped for the future. The talent crisis, specific to certain sectors that see it more than the others, but overall a global phenomenon where we're seeing a shortage of skilled talent that is ready for jobs, ready for business. So to walk you through a few of the examples, aging workforce. Now this is not really the largest concern for this region, but of course in the US or in the Western world, we see a larger portion of aging workforce that is going to retire or is retiring as we speak. And this is a key concern for sectors that are looking at technical skills to be brought in. We see this also impacting our region because the region in the Middle East is clearly dependent on expat workforce that brings experience and skills from different parts of the world. And with the dynamics changing, there's lesser options for us to recruit people and grow business here as well. Relating to the point, critical shortage of the 35 to 50 age group, the clear leaders that can take up leadership positions in businesses are also lacking here. With the large population and a very rapidly growing business only in the last 5-7 years, we don't have the experienced leaders that could manage and grow businesses in this part of the world. And that's the area we face the most shortage. Also, the highest salary increases are done mainly in areas of that age group where we see the first line, second line leaders coming up. The pace of change in marketplace, of course, globally the economy sees an uncertain future, but in this part of the world it's mainly to do with geopolitical situations and bylaws which are not certain. The Gulf countries run on monarchies which are able to change laws at any time, leaving organizations with an uncertain future projection. And the wider Middle East is seeing several political situations that are impacting their business environment. Businesses are demanding new skills with technology and changes happening in the entire commercial environment. We see new skills demanded for, and this is something the Middle East is also struggling with. The few other points here are really related to the employee engagement levels, and with the slowdown in the economy of the last 4 years, it is now a mind shift for the employers and the employees to start thinking for the future growth that's almost arrived, and to bring them to and pull them up to grow the businesses as rapidly as the demand is. They need to look at different ways of engaging their employees. Next slide. We thought of giving you an example closer to home to bring you a perspective of what the employee dynamics look like in this part of the world. Boeing, of course, as we all know, is a very large industry for the United States, and we see more than 50% of Boeing's engineers are today 50 years or older, which means most of them are eligible for retirement, and there needs to be a serious succession plan. How does this relate to the Middle East? We don't see this as a key concern today. So the problems that we deal with are largely different or slightly varying from what you would see closer to home. However, Middle East should be prepared for this coming in the next 5 to 7 to 10 years, where businesses will start demanding newer skill sets to come in. Large businesses here have still grown with expat workforce coming in and bringing talent and experience. However, that has to change. And local population has to start realizing that they need to take up these roles and jobs for the future. Next slide. I'm going to walk you through a quick snapshot of understanding what is happening in each of these 6 Gulf countries, which might be of prime interest to most of you, but we could also, at a later stage, send you some information about the other Middle East countries in a document. So to walk you through the 6 Gulf countries as we speak, these are the 6 countries which are primarily the oil-producing countries, starting with Bahrain, a small island country has seen very dim economic outlook for growth in the past 2 to 3 years. You might be aware that Bahrain is the place where we had geopolitical issues and situations with the government, which has forced several multinational organizations to withdraw their operations from there. Bahrain has been known long for being the banking sector hub of the Gulf. However, that is changing with an uncertain future and several organizations moving their head offices out of there. Oman, again a relatively small country in the Gulf, is seeing robust growth, in fact, in the past 12 to 24 months. However, the government is being pro-labor or employee-friendly, with laws being launched and introduced about minimum wage increases, and also a mandatory increase year-on-year on salaries for national employees. There's also a push for nationalization in sectors that don't see several nationals, and this is also causing concerns for the employers that have projections to grow business in this country. Saudi Arabia, a large country in the Gulf region with almost a 20+ million population, and one of the largest producers of oil for the world. This country, of course, is seeing protectionism in terms of national workforce. They have one of the largest workforce population of nationals or locals, or Saudis as you may call them, and they are coming up with laws and programs to push for more nationalization in every sector. Traditionally, oil and gas and banking have been sectors where we've seen the largest nationals population, also because they are one of the highest paying sectors. However, this is changing in Saudi Arabia with mandates for employers and organizations to recruit more and more nationals to do business successfully. In Kuwait, we see a large divide between the public and private sector. Kuwait, being one of the pioneers in the Gulf countries in terms of innovation and growth, has slowed down in the past decade or so, and today the large organizations are now focusing back on growth and understanding how they can improvise to catch up with the rest of the region. Kuwait also was one of the countries which had the highest exposure to global assets and got largely impacted by the global recession. UAE, of course, we all have heard in global news and on how Dubai, which has been a double-digit growing city, has seen several setbacks in terms of real estate and property prices, in terms of debts that they've stacked up over the years. However, we see a lot more stable economic development today. Abu Dhabi leading the front by being the large oil-producing state, but also Dubai, with the world-class infrastructure, is a city that is looked at by most multinationals as the base for doing business in the Middle East. And this is largely helping UAE as a country grow today. Qatar is making headlines, of course, across the world with their large investments, but also with very large plans for oil and gas production, and also the upcoming 2022 FIFA World Cup. They're making large attempts to distribute their rapidly growing wealth amongst the nationals. The nationals form a very small percentage of the population, almost 8 to 10%. And again, they have ambitious plans to grow their economy. Qatar saw almost double-digit GDP growth in the past 24 months. However, that's slowing down as their oil and gas production plan has been put on hold from 2012 onwards. I hope this is a good roundup of the Gulf countries, but we are happy to also share with you more information on specific countries as we run reports individually on each of them. Next slide. So in conclusion, what we'd like to show you is how the employee expectations changing in the Middle East. And this should be of key importance to you in your roles to understand what is it that your workforce is going to expect from you or is already expecting from you from here on. We're seeing change in leadership styles. We spoke about this earlier as well. Just like we saw in the Arab Spring, there are key themes that the employees would like to cover. They'd like employers to be more transparent. They'd like employers to involve them better in larger decisions of the organization and changing strategy. They would demand fairness of treatment for employees, which has been a key issue mainly in the Gulf, but also in the wider Middle East, where there's been differentiation in terms of pay and treatment for employees of different nationalities. So employees are now expecting two-way communication and also expecting more involvement in decision-making by their employers. This clearly shows that employers also have to start treating their employees differently to get the most impact from them for the performance of the business. Next slide. So that was about the wider Middle East region and how we compare it to the global workforce and the outlook of business across the globe as well. Geeta is now going to walk you through some specific information about the Arab Gulf region and what perspective we see from here.
Thank you, Harish. Over the next few slides, we are going to dive into the economic outlook for the Gulf region and also how compensation plays an important role. Next. The global news today varies across continents, and although we are connected and globalized, each zone is living in its own life cycles. We have witnessed the Eurozone stress with review of fundamental policies and the turmoil now spilling into Cyprus and Luxembourg. We've also globally witnessed a slowdown in the Asian policy with resilience to the global crisis, and globally dependent Latin America and Africa, which have steady and robust growth. But amidst this global phenomena, the Middle East did experience tremors of economic disorder. Let's take UAE for an example, where the global financial crisis, tight international credit market, and the falling oil prices constricted the economy in 2009 and 2010. But the actions taken by the central bank, along with the backing from the Abu Dhabi-based government and the UAE government, it helped the economy to stabilize. And if we have a closer look at the GCC countries, then the GDP has almost quadrupled since 2001. We also see strong government spending in other economies in the Middle East, which has encouraged diversification from the traditional oil and gas focus. So this is leading to expansion in non-oil related sectors, which will also be key in boosting the real GDP in the coming years. And we typically see this diversified investment in petrochemical sectors, fertilizers, metal production and construction. Again, because of the increased economic activity in the region, we also see an increased inflow of foreign workers, which is resulting in population growth, which could be said to be almost triple the world rate, and we are anticipating that approximately 50 million people are currently living in GCC. To conclude this slide, I would say that the GDP forecast is in positive territory for the GCC, largely because of the dominance of the oil and gas production and reserves. Next. With the global financial meltdown in 2008, most of the GCC countries had faced double-digit inflation in 2009. And even in countries where the salary increases were significantly high, such as Egypt, it did not affect the real purchasing power. In fact, the reality was that the salary increases were not enough and they did not match up to the inflation. However, with diversification in non-oil products and the government policies in the last few years, we are witnessing that the inflation has stabilized and we expect the scenario to change soon. What I would like to draw your attention to here is that although we source this information from globally recognized statistical bodies, organizations continue to budget a higher assumed rate of inflation for salary increases. Next slide, please. Being a heavily expatriate-driven region, pay composition in Middle East varies from anywhere else in the world. The most commonly used terms are basic salary, base salary, and total cash. Basic salary, simply put, is the job worth and the element on which the end-of-service benefits, salary increases, variable pay, etc. is linked to. Base salary is your guaranteed take-home pay, which includes all the fixed cash allowances like housing, transportation, utilities, etc. Some organizations in the Middle East might offer a basket of different allowances to their employees, and there will also be some organizations which would offer this as a consolidated amount to their employees. Fixed take-home pay along with the short-term variable pay like bonus or sales commission forms total cash. So I hope this gives you an introduction on how pay is defined in the Middle East. Next slide, please. As Harish mentioned in his earlier slides, that Gulf region is broadly classified into sub-regions. We have the oil-producing countries, which are called as GCC, and they have a stable forecast of 4.5 to 5.5%, which has been witnessed not just this year, but also in the previous years. Countries like Egypt, Sudan, Lebanon, etc., which have a high development, and the salary increases in these regions are mostly in line with the inflation. Next slide, please. Now, over the last decade, you must have witnessed that Gulf countries had double-digit of pay rises and varying rates of inflation. However, with the stabilizing markets, we also witnessed a continuous rise in the real pay. Back in 2007 and 2008, the cost of living was increasing faster, but the salaries of the workforce in the Gulf region was actually experiencing a real fall in real pay. Although organizations currently are working on constraining costs and making their structures lean, the salary forecasts continue to be higher than the projected inflation. So with lower inflation and stable employment outlook, real pay is set to rise. As per the recent business outlook study, which Harish ran us through in the beginning of this presentation, most organizations are anticipating a 5% growth in their business, and this is projected over the next 12 months. Now, our only concern is that if salaries continue to increase at the given rate, then probably over the next 10 years, basic salary increases will be 45% higher than what they are today. And if this continues at the rate at which it does, then probably it might become a future threat for expansion plans in the Middle East because of the increased cost of doing business in this part of the world. Next. In conclusion to this presentation, what we're saying is that the stability in GDP and inflation for the GCC region is promising, and it's substantially better than what we had expected it to be. Of course, there is an increased economic activity in the region, and to fulfill this economic activity, we need right people with the right skill sets. Organizations, therefore, are moving towards adopting better recruitment, screening, and selection practices. This is only highlighting that the HR practices in the Middle East are moving towards more mature practices, and HR as a role is evolving in this region. Although we are now globally connected and we live in a global era, what is truly globalized are the people, and truly Gulf is the best example to support this. I think with fewer options available in most of the home countries, we're seeing talent immigration from Europe and Southeast Asia. And employees from these countries are willing to take up packages which are comparatively less competitive than what they were in the past. And such issues are helping us keep pay inflation in check. Also, with changing times, organizations now need to keep a check on the increasing costs of fixed pay. So more and more organizations currently are focusing on performance management and on increasing the component of variable pay in the pay mix. Partly this is also to ensure that employees are performing and not just taking home a fixed base pay, which has been a major trend in the Middle East in the past years. Also in the coming years, I think HR has a strategic role to play, not just in creating room for businesses to move, but also to lessen the gap between the appetite for growth and rising costs. That's it for our presentation now. We are open to questions.
Thanks, Geeta. Great job. And Harish, you as well. That was a really great presentation. Before we actually get to the audience questions, there are just a few questions that we have for the audience. The first one is, would you like a copy of the Regional Business Outlook study that Harish referenced in the beginning of the webinar? And while you're answering this question, I just want to point out that all attendees will automatically receive a copy of the webinar presentation slides. So if you would, in addition, would like a copy of the Regional Business Outlook study, just select yes. And I'll give you a minute to respond to that. Everybody. Great, and then the second question we have is in regard to the different focus points that were in today's webinar. Because of this, we'd like you to select any categories that you would like more information on. So, for instance, if you'd like more information on reward communication or rewards and benefits, you would select pay. If you are interested in more information on things like retention and talent management, performance management, or training and development, you would select talent. And lastly, if you're interested in employee engagement information, also known as employee effectiveness, you could select that box. And you are able to select more than one option. All right. Looks like we have some good replies there. And in addition, after the session today, you will be prompted to complete a post-webinar survey. We would greatly appreciate it if you could just take 2 minutes to fill out your feedback for the webinar so that we can strive to improve future webinars. And with that, I'll go ahead and address the questions that came in through the chat feature. So the first question, Harish, is what exactly is ghost turnover? I think that was on one of the slides, and you didn't get to define it.
Ghost turnover is defined as the employees in the organization that are threatened by being retrenched, or the possibility of being retrenched, because they've seen other colleagues or peers of theirs being retrenched at some point, which leads to some kind of a fake turnover or disengagement from the employees that have been with them already.
Okay, great. And hopefully that answers Marilyn's question. We also had a question come in early on in the webinar asking about revenue growth by industry. Now, I know that many of you are probably interested in a specific industry, and we can certainly send you that information directly. But Harish, do we have that breakout available to offer to the attendees?
I think we can do that for the prime sectors of the industries like the oil and gas and the financial and some of the others. Probably not so possible for the smaller ones, but of course we'd be happy to answer that question if that comes up. And we can take that up individually from any of the organizations. Okay,
gotcha. Great. And Geeta, maybe this one is directed towards you, but Harish, maybe you can answer it. When we were going over the Middle East salary forecast data, we had an inquiry about salary forecasts for Israel. Are those available, and will we be able to share those with whoever is asking, or are those not available at this time? Do you know?
The Middle East salary forecasts that are mentioned on here are based on the survey results that we ran for each country in the end of last year. We've run the mid-year surveys just recently, which have been released about 2 weeks ago for each of these countries. Participation in our surveys for countries will obviously get each of these organizations access to these numbers.
Okay. All right. Then we have a couple more here. And actually, we have quite a few. Let's see. What are some of the most common allowances that we see across the Middle East?
This question will be split into two parts. One, we can speak firstly about the Gulf Cooperation Council, countries, so GCC countries, where we see the most primary allowances to be housing and transportation. These are the two allowances given pretty much by a very large percentage of organizations. Whilst in the Middle East region, outside the GCC, we don't see housing to be the most prevalent allowance, but we see mobile allowances and transportation allowances being given by them.
Okay, and I have a pretty specific question here. Are guaranteed cash elements, such as housing allowances, prevalent for local employees, aka or also known as non-expatriates, in Middle East countries based on your survey data?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you needed me to repeat it. Okay, so are guaranteed cash elements such as housing allowances prevalent for local employees in the Middle East countries based on our survey data?
Yes, they are. So the allowances are for both the national and the non-national employees, or the local or non-local employees. The only large difference would be that the national employees get something called a social allowance or a national allowance in addition to the allowances that is given to everybody else. Okay.
And just going in order here, so sorry for bouncing around, but what are the key leadership development needs for the Middle East? Do you know?
I think this is a very broad question, but what I would answer to this question is there is a lot of young leaders in this region because businesses have grown rapidly and they don't have a very experienced pipeline from anywhere in the past. There is also a need for nationalization at senior levels, which means there's rapid growth for leadership to be coached, to be able to manage and handle situations of the upturn and downturn like they saw in the last 3-4 years. So there is a sense of maturity, but of course lacks the experience that you would see in other parts of the world.
Okay, jumping back to a compensation question here. What can you tell us about folks in the Middle Eastern countries receiving a 13th and sometimes a 14th month salary?
This used to be more of a phenomenon in the past. We still see, I would say, 5 to 7% organizations across the region doing this as a practice. It's really an additional 1-month bonus or a fixed bonus given to every employee. This was more of a prevalent trend more in the past, where we would see a large number of organizations doing that because they didn't have performance management systems that would allow them to differentiate and pay people bonuses based on performance. So a decreasing trend, but still followed by 5 to 7% organizations, and more so by traditional local companies.
Okay, and I have a question here about turnover rate from Ralph. Do you have an average turnover rate per country that we could provide for the Middle East?
Yes, this is also something that's available in our country reports. So yeah, that would be covered by country. Also split by nationals and non-nationals because the rate would vary.
Ah, okay. Here's a question from Penelope. She asks, is there a big risk for GCC due to the general political situation in the neighboring countries?
Not really a big risk. The GCC economies and the ruling governments are a lot more stable because they're monarchies. There's not a big democratic environment in the GCC, although they do feel threatened and they have gotten together to be more stronger, especially after what they saw in Bahrain, where there's been issues and attempts to overthrow the government. But it's still not a large concern as compared to the Middle East.
Okay. And Nathan points out that you mentioned HR will have a critical role in helping address business growth and rising costs. What are some strategies you expect will need to be explored?
Well, the first key theme is really retention of people. What we saw in the last decade or so in the Middle East, being a very expat-dominated market, there is somewhat a fluid nature in terms of employee tenure in organizations. And loyalty remains low as compared to anywhere else because this is not home for many employees that work here. So it's clearly one of the key concerns for HR to be able to retain people so they don't have rising costs of recruiting new people and training them over a period of 6 to 8 months. So this is the first theme to look at. Some other broad themes would be to be able to effectively communicate what they're investing in their people. Again, bringing us back to the fact that in the Middle East we pay a lot of allowances as employers, and a lot of benefits are given to employees, but they don't really realize the value of this till they are communicated to them effectively. So this is also a key theme for HR to follow and ensure that the employees understand that the investment that the employers are making in them. And the other themes are really related to what we saw coming from the Arab uprising: need for transparency, need for differentiation of performance, need for acknowledgement of what they're contributing, and the involvement in the business objectives. So these are areas where HR can connect or bridge the gap between what the management is thinking and what the employees are expecting.
Okay, and what do you think about the future strategy of GCC countries? Will they depend on nationals or expats?
Well, there's been a push for nationalization for over the last decade. However, we still don't see any immediate shift for the workforce to shift over to nationalization because there's a large gap in skill sets. Although there are a large number of jobs available in the market, there's also, for example, in UAE, about 35,000 UAE nationals that are unemployed and looking for jobs. So clearly there's a gap between what the commerce and the industry is demanding in terms of talent and what the nationals workforce can provide. So that doesn't seem like an immediate threat, but of course that is their long-term 5 to 10 year vision, is to be able to penetrate more nationals into the private sector workforce mainly, because the public sector already has about 75% nationalization, whereas the private sector runs at about 5 to 7%, varying between sectors. So it's about educating the nationals to be able to take up skilled jobs and to be able to be educated and be ready for these jobs in the next 5 to 10 years.
What I would also like here to Harish's point is that within the GCC, it would also depend upon which countries you're looking at, because economies like Oman have a huge Omani local population as compared to other expat population within the country. Vis-a-vis countries like UAE, where there is a relatively smaller UAE national population and the economy actually thrives on the expat population.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Geeta. And I have more questions here. Richard says that his operations in Dubai have expressed concern that the housing market is once again heating up, making allowances difficult to match to the market rates. Do you have any thoughts or perspectives on this item or on pay level trends in Dubai in particular?
So housing rents in Dubai are heating up. I just paid 10% higher rent for my own apartment as well. So yes, there is an increase in rents, but however, this comes after the 50% drop in rents from 2008 till now. So there are two phenomena here. There's one part of the story is there are several organizations that are still paying higher allowances than the market rents are actually, because the policies were set prior to 2008. And there are certain organizations that adjusted their allowances to post-2008 numbers or figures. And those are the organizations which will start now facing the heat from employees who have to shell out more money to rent apartments, where we've seen about 15 to 20% growth in most parts of Dubai. So yes, this is something that's coming up, but however, we've not seen organizations reacting to this and increasing allowances yet. This might probably happen in the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, and Harish, earlier you mentioned that we do have salary forecast information for the large industries, and we had a question here, is the healthcare sector one of those main industries?
No, at this point we don't do large research with the healthcare sector, primarily because it's really public sector driven, at least in UAE and some of the Gulf countries, but we are working on that, and I would say in the next 6 to 12 months we would have a more significant, robust healthcare sector data available for our clients. Okay,
and in your just your knowledge, do you have an approximate percentage of companies that moved into a consolidated salary versus the allowance practice?
So yes, this trend is mainly with the multinationals. Not very prevalent, but we still see multinationals wanting to link their compensation philosophy or policy back to what their global counterparts are doing or head offices are doing. So there is a push for it, but it's still not easy because it doesn't work in terms of attracting employees, which are really looking for support from their employers for living costs such as housing and transportation. So not very prevalent, but a growing trend.
Mm-hmm. And what is the prevalency of bonus incentive pay for non-managers in the Gulf?
It totally varies by sector. There is a large push for incentive pay in sectors like banking or financial services, whereas not as much in the oil and gas industry. Quite a significant incentive in commission payout in the retail sector again, or in the FMCG sector. So it varies by sector. Generally, in comparison or drawing a conclusion to global comparison, variable pay is something that is still lower as compared to other parts of the world, and a growing phenomenon.
Okay, and culturally speaking, broadly in the Middle East, is employees' pay and pay components treated with confidentiality?
I would say, in my experience of working in other parts of the world, relatively, people here would share their salary figures with each other more than anywhere else, or their grading or position within the organization more than anywhere else. There's more transparency. People value job titles. People value the grades and the kind of structure or pay structure they are on. So it is shared more often than not.
Okay. And I am conscious of time. We have 3 more questions that came in through the chat. If anybody has any more questions, you can reach out to Harish or Geeta directly, which I'll give the contact information in just a minute here. And also, we will be sending the presentation slides to you. The contact information will be on that email, so you can feel free to reach out to us directly as well. So moving on here, I guess this is referring back to the question on allowances. Krista asks, what is the national allowance for?
So that's a very interesting question. So the national allowance is given to the locals of the country to kind of subsidize them in terms of comparing themselves to public sector pay. It is an allowance given to nationals to incentivize them to be working in the private sector versus the public sector. And why so? Because the Gulf countries are one of the only probably countries in the world where you see public sector pay being significantly higher than the private sector pay. And so a lot of the nationals prefer to work in the government or the public sector entities or ministries, whereas the push for private sector will only come when they get some incentives. So this is why the national allowance, social allowance is paid to nationals. It varies in terms of how it's paid in different countries. So UAE does not have a very large prevalence of it, but there are still organizations that do it mainly in the oil and gas and financial sector, not so much in the family-owned conglomerates or businesses, and hence they don't see many nationals within those sectors. In Qatar, for example, nationals get a social allowance, which is kind of an index laid out for all the private sector, and everybody pays a similar amount. Plus, they get about 2 months of basic salary as cash, which is given instead of the travel tickets given to expatriates at the end of the year. So the form of payment or compensation varies in each of the countries, but it is paid mainly only to nationals to compensate them to be working in the private sector.
Okay, thank you for that. Great answer. So we do have 2 more questions from Penelope and Colleen. I see that we are right at 1 o'clock. So Penelope and Colleen will reach out to you directly to answer your questions. And we'll basically just wrap up. If you indicated that you wanted more information, whether it was a copy of the report or a request for pay talent or employee engagement information, a Hay Group representative will be in touch. If you need to reach out directly, please feel free to reach out to Harish or Geeta. Their information is on the screen there. And at this point, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and a huge thank you to Harish and Geeta for taking the time after their workday to sit with us and talk to us about the Middle East. And we hope that everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you.